Welcome back, Mavericks. Tonight we're going to talk about Groupsets, components, and upgrades 101. Recently had a conversation with a friend of mine I commute with, and if you're an adult coming back to cycling, or you're in cycling as a noob and potentially getting to the point where you might want to consider upgrading or expanding your bike to fit your new abilities because you've been riding for a while, this episode we're going to talk about what it means and what kind of options you have when it comes to upgrading. So let's get to it. Did you know that every time you like and subscribe to this channel and click that notification button, you're saving a kitten? Think of the kittens! If you're coming back to cycling, particularly as an adult, and you haven't ridden in a long time, you're dealing with cassettes that are 10 or 11 speeds. There's a lot going on here versus when we were kids. Understanding the basics of what the names of the components are, how they work and interact together, and what upgrades mean and what upgrades are possible.
This is your group set. You may not know it's called a group set, but it is. It consists of your crank, which is the front large gears where you put your feet on the pedals and go, the brakes, the shifters, the front derailleur, which moves the chain on the crank from the large gear to the small and back, the rear derailleur, which moves the chain up and down the cassette, which is the thing in the back of your bike on the wheel that allows you to go faster or slower based on the size of the gear and the ratio of the gears that you're dealing with from front to back. This makes up your group set. Let's move from the front to the back of the bike. These are your shifters, as you're probably familiar with. They're also your brakes in most cases today. They're integrated, so you can shift up and down the crank and the cassette with the left or right shifter and use the left or right brake to stop the front or rear wheels or both. This is your crank set. It's where you put your feet on the pedals. It consists of your crank arms, your pedals, and usually 2 gears, sometimes 1, in very rare cases on older group sets, 3 gears. But either way, this is the front of your bike. And when it shifts from smaller to larger, the pedaling gets harder. And that's important to know because it's the exact opposite of what you experience in the back.
This outer Campanolo is a 53, and it says so right on the side of the actual component itself, and you can easily see that on most of your cranks, so you understand the size of the gear in the front.
And this is your front derailleur, where you shift the left shifter to move across the gears on your crank set. That's its sole job. And this is your rear derailleur. You use your right shifter to be able to move up to the easier to pedal gears, the larger ones, or down to the smaller gears on your rear cassette, which is on your rear wheel. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the rear derailleur makes all that possible, and you shift it with the right shifter.
In the rear, we have what we call a cassette.
It consists of a series of gears, small to large, and that's based on teeth size that allows you to make the pedaling harder or easier based on the size of the gear. In the rear of your bike, the bigger the size of the gear, the more teeth it has, the easier it is to pedal. The smaller the gear, the harder. It is exactly the opposite of what you experience on the front at the crank.
And typically with a 10 or 11 speed bike, it'll start somewhere around 11 teeth on the smallest one, and it'll go up to 27, 29, 30, 32, 34 in some cases nowadays.
In the front, the bigger the gear, the harder to pedal. In the back, the bigger the gear, the easier to pedal. And this has to do with gear ratio.
The gear ratio is the number of times you can divide the cog size in the rear number into the crank in the front. So if you have a 51 as a nice round number and a 17 in the back, that's going to go in there 3 times, right? 51 divided by 17 is 3. So your ratio is 3. So you have 3 teeth in the front for every 1 in the back. Now, why do you care? As the ratio changes, your bike either gets easier or harder to pedal. And depending on whether or not you're switching the chain to the bigger ring in the front or the bigger ring in the back, you make your bike either harder or easier to pedal. And they are the exact opposite of each other. In the rear of your bike, the smaller the cog, the harder it is to pedal. When you get to the front of your bike and you switch the left shift lever to change from one to the other, the smaller the front gear, the easier your bike is to pedal, right? I have a 2x10. That means I have 20 gear possibilities, right? I have 2 in the front and 10 in the back. So I have a total of 20 possibilities. A bigger gear means that you are higher up in the number. 1 would be the small gear in the front and the big gear in the back. 20 would be the big gear in the front and the small gear in the back. So when you're pedaling in a bigger gear, when you hear nerds on bikes talk about stuff like that, you are pedaling in a larger front and a smaller back. If you grew up driving or learned to drive a stick shift car, you understand this concept. When you were in a lower gear, like first gear, you can take off from a stop, you can go up hills easier, you can start from a stop on a hill easier than if you were in 4th or 5th gear in your car. It's exactly the same on your bike. Your left hand will control the front, where the crankset is. Your right hand will control the gears in the cassette, the cogs in the back. And so most of the time you'll be using your right hand to change up and down the cassette, keeping either the big or small chainring in the front, unless you need to change that for significant hills or things like that. When you're talking about upgrades, why is this important? Well, you can only upgrade so much in a group set. I know this is going to stun you, so take a seat. You're going to have to sit down for this one. Bike manufacturers make things difficult and proprietary on purpose. What? That conversation we started with at the beginning of this episode, my friend has an 11-speed rear cassette, but it goes to 26 currently. Now, she has a short cage rear derailleur that will only allow her to go to 30 as a maximum tooth size in the rear cog on the cassette. But 26 to 30 is no small distance when it comes to pedaling and on hills in particular. The larger the difference between your smallest cog and your largest cog, the more possibilities you have for hills and shifting and whatnot. That's all based on these gear ratios we've been talking about. And if you're new to bikes or you're trying to get yourself accustomed to what you want to do with your bike or potentially upgrade it, the gear ratio is important. And what your limits are is going to be based on the components you have on your bike. All right, now we're going to talk about some facts, some frequently asked questions that folks I've heard again and again when they're asking about, if they can upgrade, what they can do, etc., etc. So let's get into it.
Consider supporting the channel by becoming a Patreon so we can share more bike love worldwide. If you do, you'll be automatically entered in periodic raffles of bicycles from my collection.
All right, so some commonly asked questions we frequently hear in the bike shop from folks who, particularly those who are new to biking, are things like, can I mix components between group sets? So could I run, if I'm running a 105 group set on Shimano, could I put an Ultegra cassette on when I'm upgrading? Yeah, absolutely. The general answer is sort of sometimes. Could you do a Campagnolo group set with Shimano drivetrain? The answer is no, because the way Shimano and Campagnolo do the spacing between their cogs and how the shifters are tuned to that is different for the two manufacturers. And it makes you mental as a bike owner when you want to be able to, why aren't these things a standard? It doesn't matter who manufactures it. I can plug it into this wheel or this hub or no, you give up that dream now. Now, there are so many exceptions, but in general, the answer to the can I mix components between group sets within the same manufacturer is sort of, sometimes. Can I use multi-gear components on my one-gear bike? The answer is sort of, sometimes. Why sort of sometimes? Well, you can take apart this cassette. Maybe there's a gear right here that you want to utilize for your one-gear bike. And I will tell you that most of the one-gear components out there that are made for Shimano hubs on the rear wheel. It's very difficult, ask me how I know, to build a Campanola single-speed rear wheel that will work, particularly with the spacers, because a lot of the spacers you'll buy are made for Shimano hubs, and it takes time to find a set that isn't. Can I upgrade parts in my group set without having to replace the entire group set? And again, the answer is sort of, sometimes. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to depend on your manufacturer. It's going to depend on the size you want to go to for the cassette versus the rear derailleur, and whether or not it's a short cage or a long cage. Short cage, long cage. Short cage, long cage. You do, you don't. You do, you don't. Okay. All right, so that's it. This is how you can potentially upgrade your existing bike. But at a minimum, understand why gear ratios, cassette sizes, and derailleurs matter in how comfortable your bike is to ride, how easy it is, and whether or not you can change that to suit you more. And the answer is sort of, sometimes. So thanks for stopping by at the Maverick Cyclist. Now come on, let's ride.
This episode is Bill approved. He wants to remind you that YouTube's algorithm only shares our content with other people who love cycling if you hit like and subscribe. So help us out.